The Nitrogen era of Thomas and Friends is the era consisting of seasons 13, 14, 15, and 16, and their 4 respective movies. It is notorious for what most fans consider to be the worst era of the show. All of the stakes that turned the series about the Blue Train and his friends into a mandatory, educational, brain-dead show for babies are all displayed in these 4 seasons. New characters who are just forgettable or flat out unlikable, flanderized character syndrome, overuse of alliteration and rhyming dialogue, stories that revolve around gimmicky concepts for toy marketing purposes, and the worst of all is the simplified writing. No matter what season you watch or what different elements the episodes utilize, every single one of them follows the same trend, and it makes the seasons feel too boring and redundant to watch, and it makes those episodes that are bad even worse than they already are. However, it doesn't mean that this bad era is devoid of good merits. There are a batch of episodes that are admittedly pretty decent, whether they attempt to add some world building or do something interestingly good with the characters. You clicked on today's video for me to list off 10 episode highlights in order of seasons 13 to 16. My list is all just my personal preference. We're going to go through the episodes in chronological release order, rather than a top 10 list worst to best. Now, before I begin, I want to give a couple honorable mentions. If you want to know my opinions on these episodes, please look into the description below. Alright, let's begin. Number 1. Tickle Pink. This episode is regarded as one of the best to come from the Nitrogen era by most fans, and I can see why. In this one, James is painted in a pink undercoat before his red paint can be applied. Unfortunately, he is let out of the steamworks early before he can be repainted, much to his displeasure. To make James's day even worse, he gets laughed at by everyone when seen in his pink undercoat. After several attempts to hide away, James is forced to put aside his paranoia and get on with his job. The premise of this episode is on a decent standard because it took inspiration from a story from the Railway series, Henry Sees Red from book number 37. The key difference between these two sources is that the original story is about Henry striving to work his hardest and earning his green paint by the end, while Tickle Pink is about James dealing with paranoia and insecurity. That is why this episode works so well, because it puts James in a position of insecurity, showing his sides of vulnerability as opposed to his usual cocky and arrogant self, that will become prominent in the later Brenner era. Nitrogen's animation doesn't look the best early in its run, but it doesn't look awful either. It's nothing impressive, but simple, so the animation department can improve upon their craft later on. James has fared well during this era, but his roles are hit and miss. This episode manages to bring him into a new light rather than the usual trend of him always learning a lesson in humility. Definitely an interesting way to use his character. Number 2. Snow Tracks. The characters of the STEAM team are never written consistently during the Nitrogen era, all except for one of them, and that is Gordon. Gordon is the big outlier of the main cast, as most of his roles and appearances are usually standouts, and Snow Tracks is no exception. What this episode, and the entire Nitrogen era in general, do so perfectly well is the brotherly bond between Gordon and Thomas. Thomas and Gordon have clashed together ever since the first ever episode of the series, but they have learned to respect each other and formed an alliance after their most humbling incidents. And they had this on and off sibling rivalry in seasons beyond. It's so satisfying to see their brotherly bond still intact this late in the game, which is a nice reflection on their alliance. Gordon still has the tendency to show off, but deep down, he does have underlying loyalty towards his friends. Using his dynamic with Thomas to show off his big brother / fatherly side of him is such a smart move. When push comes to shove, Gordon will be more than willing to help his colleague, the one whom he used to be rude to in the past. Spencer also makes a quick cameo appearance, which I used to laugh at when I was younger.
Spencer was covered from footplate to fender.
Rattle my rods! I'm as dirty as a ditch!
The episode ends on a good note with Gordon announcing that every engine is the best, and Thomas and the other engines agreeing with him. A really wholesome, well-rounded character-driven story. What more could you ask for a Gordon-centered episode? Number 3. Charlie and Eddie. This may be a controversial placement given how many fans have despised it. On the surface level, this episode seems wrong to most fans because they say that Edward is typically out of character. True, Edward isn't exactly in character all of the time, but I don't think that's the case here. If you look at this episode's writing in a different perspective, you can see how the role actually fits Edward's character. When Charlie desires for fun, Edward just acts like a spoilsport at first, and when he gives in to Charlie's playful nature, he is still level-headed and still takes the responsibility for his job deeply. Edward isn't portrayed as a daredevil or an arrogant snob like in the hit model era. Here, he shows that he has a raw competitive edge underneath, and strives to prove that older engines can be just as cool as younger engines. After all, he is the old iron.
So the old iron fought you after all, chuckled Edward.
It's a character trait that feels right to Edward's persona, at least in my opinion. As for Charlie himself, I'm never a huge fan of him. He's not a character for someone to like, but rather a catalyst for plot convenience. He's always used as the source of a conflict, not only in this episode, but various others. My favorite part of this gem is its music. The main theme that plays during the race scenes is an absolute bop. The score is what this era excels at the best, and this theme is one of the most catchiest tracks I've ever heard. Overall, this is a fairly decent Edward-centered episode, and if you disagree, I'm fine with it. Number 4. Victor Says Yes. I can honestly say without a shadow of a doubt that the characters introduced in the Nitrogen era are not the most well-known faces of the franchise. With only a few exceptions, these characters feel like products of their time. They are very underutilized and just forgettable, given how they're overshadowed by the main cast. But what I absolutely appreciated about this episode is that it gives the new characters some time in the spotlight without being overshadowed by other characters. In any other episode that features the new characters, they're not the protagonists who we follow in the story. Instead, it's the main protagonist whom they're paired with. Victor Says Yes breaks the trend by having Victor as the primary character in the plot, and the other characters subjected to secondary roles. Oh yeah, the cast chosen for this episode is a fun one. Along with the SEAM team, Ari and Bert also get a good chunk of screen time. Another thing that's done very well is the moral of this episode, and how Victor is written for it. In retrospect, Victor is in charge of the Sodor Steamworks, and he has the responsibility to keep everything in good order and will not stand any nonsense, especially Kevin's clumsiness.
Sorry, boss, it was a slip of the hook.
Oh, Kevin!
Though he is a wise and friendly engine who is ready to help others when they're down. However, this episode shows that Victor isn't perfect either, and not exempt from making mistakes of his own. He gets himself overwhelmed with the increasing number of engines waiting for repairs, but ends up overdoing the job and causing confusion. You can well try to do everything, but you just can't handle it, man. I feel that the usual formula of the character making a mistake and learning a lesson works here, because it adds flaws to a new character that needs some layers, and I commend this episode for using it. Despite how the other newbies got the short stick, I'm so glad that Victor got the better treatment out of them all. Number 5. Jitters and Japes. You might knew this is going to be on my list, and it's one about Topham's beloved mother, the Dowager. Back in the model series, Dowager Hatt was just a minor secondary character who only appeared in 3 episodes in that era. But since the show's transition into CGI, she began to play more larger significant roles. There are a lot of good things this episode has to offer. Let me start by saying that I like how much the writers are pushing up Dowager Hatt. She has become more involved in multiple episodes, especially in the Nitrogen era. I love that she is portrayed more than a firm mother to Topham. She is also a thrill-seeker type who takes joy on the wilderness and doesn't like going slow and resting. It also allows for subtle humor, which is something the episode excels at best. Although Misty Island totally breaks the boundaries of realism and real railway practice, if it is used on a decent standard, then I can let that pass. You know what's weird about this? The logging locos do not appear at all. Most of the episode takes place on their home quarters, but they are nowhere to be seen, strangely. Oh well, I guess they wouldn't contribute much to the episode at all. I feel that I also need to address Toby's role, because I think he is used fairly well here. When Thomas ponders about what the Dowager needs, Toby is the first one he comes to for answers, since he is older and more experienced. I really like that. This is how Toby should be played, as the experienced elder type who can give good advice, not as a scaredy cat who is afraid of trees. As for Thomas himself, he has a decent role here too. He is not being a selfish, nonsensical jerk like in his other episodes. He is being a selfless, considerate guy who tries his best to give the Dowager a fun time. In spite of how bad the Misty Island-centered episodes are, I find Jitters and Japes to be an overlooked gem. A solid episode with fun characters and great humor contained within. Certainly one of my favorites. Number 6. Gordon and Ferdinand. An episode where a logging loco gets paired with big pompous Gordon, which is a very fun dynamic. Whenever Gordon is paired with another character, he's always at his best when he has someone to bounce off of. Having him cross paths with a goofy, bashful, and inquisitive character like Ferdinand is an interesting move.
That's right!
What this episode succeeds at is how well presented the two main protagonists are. Gordon, being Gordon, is prideful and self-centered, and he views himself above everyone, including the fun-loving logging locos. When he is told that he had to work with Ferdinand, he immediately scoffs. He tries to resist Ferdinand at first, but gets carried away and pulls himself back down to earth. Ferdinand, meanwhile, shows that he has a big heart under his bashful exterior. He gets to be the center of attention, and being the gentle giant loco he is, makes a good impression in front of everyone, and later helps Gordon out of a muddle. With major screen time, we get to hear Ferdinand talk in other words besides, "That's right."
You should slow down, Gordon! I'm here, Gordon. I can help.
The logging locos are never anybody's favorite characters, but Ferdinand is definitely the most likable of the trio. I also like how both of the two protagonists bring out the best in each other. Ferdinand brings out Gordon's more caring and humble side, and in turn, Gordon lets Ferdinand have all the glory. Another fantastic episode for the Big Blue Engine, and the best for one of the series' least popular characters. Number 7. Edward the Hero. This is everybody's favorite Nitrogen Thomas episode, and for good reason. Not only is it one of Edward's better episodes this late in the show's lifespan, but it is the best representation of his character in the Nitrogen era. Writer Sharon Miller really got his character spot on. In this one, Edward tries to act like a hero and goes through an arc of self-discovery. It's a type of day in the life story that actually works for Edward's character, and doesn't feel too far out of his field. His true personality traits are highlighted greatly here. His cheeky and infectious demeanor to cheer Charlie up. He is thoughtful and kind enough to help Dowager Hatt, and his softer, gentle nature towards animals. Edward has benefited greatly since the CGI series began. The writers were able to get rid of his character regression from the hit model era, and gradually revert him back into his true classic form. I love it. Something else to enjoy here is Edward's theme. It's a perfect representation of his portrayal, and also pretty catchy to listen to. But what actually makes this episode stand out is that it breaks the overused formula of a flawed character making illogical mistakes and learning lessons. It may still be formulaic and repetitive, but it's a nice deviation from the usual shtick, which I wish I could say the same for most episodes. I have nothing else to say than what's already been said. Edward the Hero is simply good. Overall, it's a worthy gem from an era of greed and simplicity. Number 8. Percy and the Calliope. This is one of those types of episodes that comes with very silly circumstances, but still manages to be enjoyable. And it's a Percy-centered episode too. Percy has been done dirty a lot during this era, and his episodes are some of the worst of these seasons. But that's not to say that he doesn't have this one gem in the rough. I think what this episode does pretty well is its concept and world building. The plot revolves around an old rusty calliope that is en route to be scrapped, and Percy tries whatever he can to save it. Unlike Percy's other episodes which feature unrealistic and gimmicky ideas, the calliope is an inspired concept and adds some substance for the story, and the story itself feels like something out of the classic series. An episode about something old that is deemed to be useless and outdated, but gets saved and restored, and Percy's been in that story before. I'll admit that Percy's methods to fix the calliope are quite ridiculous, but hey, it's nitrogen era logic for you. Don't ask questions. There are other good things to enjoy from this episode. First, I really like how Diesel is used here, being as a foil to Percy. He isn't there to cause harm, but to be an obstacle in Percy's enabling. And I also like how he is completely unfazed with Percy's success at the end. I need to mention the animation here, which is really aged well over the 4 seasons. The engines lean side to side while running, and the train consists becomes more varied, with diverse rolling stock and different colored trucks, which is something that the later CGI seasons never did. And I also like how the calliope shudders with excessive steam erupting from the pipes. It's so lively. It's these little details that make a world of difference and should not be underestimated. And finally, the cherry on top of this cake is the rendition of the original Thomas theme played by the calliope. Robert Hartshorne could have composed a completely different theme, but nope. He composed the original song. Quite a homage. All in all, this is a wonderful episode for Percy. And if you're looking for Thomas classic quality, this gem is highly recommended. Man, oh man, this is so great. Number 9. Don't Bother Victor. I have talked about this episode before in my character study video on Peter Sam, so I might repeat a bit of what I've said then. It has really grown on me ever since I first watched it when I was younger, and it still holds up now. The episode does fall flat for reusing an already existing episode plot, the plot of the main character being in charge, and ends up causing confusion in a matter of 3 strikes. Hell, this plot was already used for another narrow gauge episode prior, that being Sir Handel in charge. In my opinion, Don't Bother Victor is more superior than the former. The whole problem with Sir Handel in charge is that it's a very mediocre episode with nothing interesting or integral to offer, whereas the latter has better stakes. The engines have broken down and Peter Sam tries to help them out. His ideas are kinda silly, but I don't really care for that. Anyway, I think Peter Sam is the right character for the main role, given the circumstances. In his true form, he is usually naive and infectious, and would take things a bit too seriously. He isn't being an expert or anything, just a little misguided. Yes, it's a typical average 3 strikes formula story, but the other aspects of the episode make up for it. First, it's nice to see Victor in a different setting outside the Steamworks, and interacting with characters that we never see him interact with before. Also, I love the new medium the team were using for the narrow gauge engines. A huge effort was made to tie the Skarloey Railway more with the real-life Tallyclin Railway. The fact that they went as far as taking reference and details from the real-life counterparts to rig the CGI models of engines, rolling stock and all is superb, and they deserve so much credit. On top of that, they even went as far to give the characters Welsh accents, which really helps to tie them to their Welsh origins.
Thank you, Victor.
So, for a narrow gauge centered episode in the Nitrogen era, if not the CGI series as a whole, I think Don't Bother Victor is decent enough. Maybe if it didn't have that out of place name drop of Duncan, it would have been spotless.
Duncan's rods are rattling. He needs Victor.
No.
But it's still a good episode nonetheless. Who wouldn't like a nice little story of Peter Sam? Remember what I've said about the main core characters being butchered in the Nitrogen era? Out of all of them, the one who was treated the worst was Thomas himself. Given how lack of effort and passion was put into writing the series, the writers really didn't have a solid idea of what to do with the show's main character, so they always defaulted to stretch his personality depending on whatever the circumstances. One day, Thomas will act like a supportive soul to his friends, and another day, he will be an incompetent, brainless moron who goes around and causes all sorts of shenanigans. Thomas never felt like the true Thomas we know from the classic series. But the rare moments where they get Thomas right, they definitely get him right. His brotherly bond with Gordon feels quite nuanced, and I do like him in jitters and japes, like I've talked about. Now this brings us to the final hidden gem on the list. Number 10. Happy birthday, sir. I have saved the best one for last. There are many good aspects to take in from this episode. Just like Percy and the Calliope, Happy Birthday Sir also attempted to add some world building, tied with an inspired concept. In this one, we are given a bit of Sodor's history, as well as a bit of background about Sir Topham Hatt's birthday. The whole flashback scene at the start is really wonderful and very well detailed. I love that we get to see a younger Topham in his mid-20s stage before he gained the weight. There is also continuity with the established lore of Sodor, with Edward being the engine who carried young Topham in the old carriage, which is definitely good consistency given that Edward was one of the first Sodor engines at that point in time. And the old carriage is also a nice piece of world building to Sodor's lore. Once again, Nitrogen's animation here is stellar and oozing with detail. The flashback scene and the focus shot of the carriage are really well made, and the subtle shaking that Winston makes feels real and lively. This is the animation department that truly cared for adding little details, and their efforts should not be underappreciated. Now let's talk about the episode's two protagonists. As per usual, Thomas is being stubborn and unlikable like he'd be in this era, but I think it kinda works in this scenario. He takes responsibility for his work very seriously and tries to keep Winston in line. He doesn't have any desires or selfish affairs. He cares about his work and wants to please Sir Topham Hatt. Sure, he's quite stubborn to pay attention to Winston, but it's better than him not listening to reason and common sense. So he's more like a skeptical guardian figure to Winston. And speaking of Winston, he is one of the better new characters introduced in the Nitrogen era, so it's cool to see him star in a main role. His goal to find the old carriage for Topham's birthday is pretty admirable. If there is anything negative to say, it's just that the episode carries the same usual shtick like most Nitrogen era episodes. 3 strikes formula, repetitive narrative, and simplified dialogue. Also, isn't it too much of a coincidence that Thomas and Winston would happen to find the old carriage sitting in the woods? Like, how did nobody notice it was there before? But other than that, Happy Birthday Sir is simply remarkable, with a very satisfying ending to it. In a way, it feels like a finale to this era's run, and it's a good way to cap off my list of hidden gems. So, there you have it. 10 highlights of the Nitrogen Thomas era. This video took ages to work on, but I'm glad it's all done and over with. It's a video project that I'm proud to make. The whole point of this is to give the series' most overhated era some love, instead of the usual backlash it always gets. And I hope that other fans will do the same when they watch this video. I'm sorry that I wasn't active on YouTube recently. School studies are my main priority as of now. This is my last year in high school, so I have to put my head into it. So you can't expect much content on my channel, but that doesn't mean I'll stop making videos. I just won't be active as much as I used to. That's all from me, folks. I thank you all for your patience and support, and be sure to stay tuned to see more. Goodbye, everybody.